Hello, I'm Nana Sajaia, and on behalf of the Center for Russian Studies, welcome to this series of interviews on Russia. Today, I'll be speaking with a renowned Russian scholar and an author, Sergei Medvedev. On the 30th anniversary of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we will be discussing aftermaths of the collapse and how it shaped Russian Federation. Sergei, thank you very much for finding time, especially in this busy period of busy season of holidays, which also happens to be the 30th anniversary of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Let's start beginning from there. 30 years later, how far Russian society has come from the Soviet Union?
Not too far. I think it has returned essentially back to the old Soviet habits and ways. And I think good proof of this was the recent hockey match, hockey tournament in Moscow, in which the Russian team was wearing the uniforms saying SSSR. So they had this archaic, retro kind of uniforms for the Russian hockey team, and they had the Soviet hockey uniform. So yeah, I think it's sort of a political project, and Putin had famously announced the Soviet Union to be the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. One of the first things he did when coming to power was returning the Soviet anthem. And generally, I mean, the political atmosphere, the public atmosphere is very much reminiscent of the Soviet times. So in a sense, the Soviet period had not ended in the minds of the elites and of the large part of the population.
This has been widely discussed in academia, in other circles where they discuss Russia and the Soviet Union, but I wonder what your take is. What is the one thing, if you were to name one thing that people miss about the Soviet Union? Why are people still nostalgic about those days?
I think that the Russian people are really paternalistic, and they miss the big paternalistic state, the sense of stability and predictability and belonging to a certain caste or corporation. Actually, this has been pretty much recreated in the present day Russia. It's a caste society, and people belong to certain corporations of power or state-run big enterprises, or the big ministries, the so-called estates of budgetniki, the receivers of the state budget. So, and I think this is pretty much Soviet and what people miss in the Soviet Union. There was a sense of perspective, a sense of stability, the guaranteed pension, the guaranteed medical care. Okay, not top level, not probably top notch, but still there was some sort of social guarantees. And Russia now also has been thrown in the past 30 years, has been ruled very much by the principles of liberalism, neoliberalism. It's not a liberal country, but I mean, in terms of social services and in terms of relations between labor and capital, this is a neoliberal country. And people are really exposed to the wild market. And of course, they are lost and disoriented in this new world in which they have to make choices. And they long for this sort of stability and predictability. Another thing people miss in the Soviet Union is probably the greatness, because what the elite, the propaganda had told the people in the past 10, 15 years, that Russia is humiliated. There's a sense of a humiliated nation. There's a very deep resentment, ressentiment, very much like Germany in the 1920s. Saying that, look, we once were a great power and everyone was fearing and respecting us, and this is no longer. So shouldn't we be like the Soviet Union in the past when everyone was fearing us? And so this is the sense of a perverse sense of national pride and belonging, and this kind of an imperial chauvinism that inspires the hearts and minds of many people.
You mentioned greatness, and that was my next question. What's your take here? How did the notion of Держава played into it? Is it something that was taken from Russian people and that's why they're upset? Or is it that they were replaced by other powers like United States?
I think it's a constructed thing. I'm a constructivist in my thinking, and I think it's a imagined constructed discourse, which sort of is summoned each time when Russia is going through the period of internal transformation. And the country is then called the Держава, and people are invited to take pride in some kind of imperial policy, imperial exploits, be it the late 19th century, be it the Stalinist Soviet Union, let's say in the late 40s or the 1950s, be it in the Putin period. So it's it's a sort of a discourse which is used as an instrument of power, and it's a consolidating discourse for many people in the Soviet Union and in today's Russia, and it's like a substitute for solving the domestic issues of the country. So the current authorities cannot really resolve many domestic issues, like, poor infrastructure, or, for instance, fighting the COVID, and economic growth, and conditions for the small and medium businesses. And, there's lots of domestic problems. But each time this is all compensated by this, big cloud called the державность, that Russia is now a great power, Russia is feared across the world, Russian flag is flying in Syria or elsewhere, that, Russia is the main player in deciding the fate of Ukraine, and so on. So many of the Russian imperial exploits are used as a symbolic compensation for the failures at home.
During these 30 years, there have been many theories what brought the Soviet Union to the end, from Gorbachev's role to Reagan's role to the role of rock music and so on and so on. 30 years later, when we are looking back, was it inevitable, the dissolution of the Soviet Union?
I think so, yes. I think it was destined to happen 10 years earlier, 10 years later. There were a lot of structural disbalances inside the Soviet Union such. So this would have happened with Gorbachev, without Gorbachev, maybe a little bit later, had not Gorbachev accelerated it. But the Soviet Union was, and Russia still is, structurally unsustainable in today's world. It's just too old-fashioned, too archaic. It's a big, overextended empire with a large, undeveloped, unsustainable territory, with a huge global ambition, with an outmoded military thinking, the army, which is not fit for the challenges of the present day, with the economic structure. Also is a raw materials supplier to the world market. So there are many archaic things to the Soviet imperial structure, and Russia has inherited them from the Soviet Union. So yes, I think the Soviet Union, the breakup of the USSR was inevitable due to economic hardship, due to the fact that the Soviet Union couldn't fit into the information revolution. The Soviet Union had absolutely lost the information revolution. The economic goods it produced were not competitive on the world market. They could only be consumed within the Soviet Union or within the socialist camp. And actually, this was an imperial space cemented by fear and military force. And the big empires had all ended in the 20th century, except the Soviet Union. So all empires had crumbled: the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Third Reich, the British Empire, the French Empire, and they have all developed into like a post-colonial, post-imperial condition, and they were like the big nation states left, like Great Britain, like France, like Germany. With Russia, the problem is it hasn't really become a nation state. It is still living in an imagined imperial past, and it hasn't imagined itself for the present and for the future. It's a country in limbo. It doesn't have an identity except the Soviet identity, except the old Russian imperial identity. So Putin project has really reversed the historical trend. It had made the people think archaically. So we're still living in our own past, be it the Soviet hockey team, or be it the like great victory of 1945, or be it the victory of 1812 over Napoleon. But anyway, it's the past, not the future. And this is a big problem. So all empires are gone, and Russian Empire, in a way, is still here, despite the breakup of the Soviet Union.
That's a great point you're making here. And it also relates to modern days Russia, when Russia, or Kremlin, we shall say, is seeking for external crisis when it has domestic problems. Can you explain that to me, like socially? Why is that working? People are not benefiting from wars in Ukraine or from occupying Georgia, or Russian military is dying in Syria under different groups. Why is it still working? How is that still something Kremlin has capitalized on?
Well, because you need not necessarily use rational explanations for understanding people's behavior. People are not rational in their decision making, even less so in Russia. Like the COVID crisis has shown that this country is governed by irrationality, prejudice, fears, and deep social complexes. So why should they be rational about their own destiny and saying that we don't need the war in Donbass, a war in Georgia, or in war in Syria? No, people would rather say, hey, I mean, like the people that go fight and die in Donbass, what makes them go there? Are they so big Russian imperialists? Are they? No, it's just, I think it's problems back home, and lack of hope, lack of perspective, and people just abandon their, some small job that they have somewhere in the recessive region, and, take up arms and go fight and die in Donbass. So in a sense, this works for the bigger population. So they are simulations, they're simulacra of greatness. People cannot change their daily lives, they cannot change their daily condition, and yet they can, turn on the TV, and the presenter tells them, oh, look, I mean, Washington wants to talk to us about Ukraine, or about nuclear disarmament, or about the red lines and the borders of the former Soviet Union. And it somehow fills the hearts of the people with some kind of illusions of greatness. So this is not about rationality. This is about the mass consciousness, the mass psychosis, about the loss of empire, and the fact that once again, I think it all boils down to the point that the Russian Empire isn't really gone. In the past 100 years, it has underwent through stages of dissolution in 1917 and in 1991, but it hasn't dissolved yet. Finally, we're still waiting the third breakup. So I think what we need is a final and ultimate breakup of the Russian Empire. And it doesn't really needn't entail like a new territorial breakup, that there will be Muscovy left and there will be the Rязань Principality and Pskov Principality, or, separate Siberia, separate Caucasus, separate Far East. It need not be so, but I mean, the empire has to fall apart in people's heads and in the structure of Russian foreign policy and in Russian military thinking. So Russia has to invent itself as a nation state, not an ethnic nation, but a civic nation. So this has yet to happen. And I think the current structure is unsustainable. And we're living through the last final act of the Russian imperial breakup, which has taken well over 100 years.
Do you see any traits of that happening, of a new, so say, deconstruction or decentralization?
No, not yet. I'm sort of thinking analytically. I'm thinking in terms of resources and global trends and sustainability of the current territorial setup of the current foreign policy. It's I really do hope it's the last stage. And the the real if we look at the uh, outcomes of Russian foreign policy, they're basically all negative because Russia is losing parts of former empire. For instance, the real outcome of Putin's policy towards Ukraine has been ultimately the loss of Ukraine. It wasn't predestined. Like if we look at this like 10 years ago, it wasn't predetermined. The Ukraine could, for a long time stay in this strange condition between Russia and the West sitting on the two chairs. But now with the annexation of Crimea and with the occupation of Donbass and with permanent threatening the big war, Russia has finally alienated Ukraine and torn it away from Russia. So the new Ukraine, whatever there happens, a new Ukraine or a new Georgia will no longer be, a part of the Russian Empire. So on the one hand, there are like this toxic developments, like war in Georgia, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, war in Ukraine. But as a result, Russia has surrounded itself with what I would call a quasi-empire, a toxic belt of territories which it has to sustain, but which leads to problems with the outside world. So starting from, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Crimea, Donbass, Transnistria, now Belarus, the terrorist state of Belarus, the terrorist regime, right? I mean, Russia has built a belt of toxicity along its south-western borders. So so this is a funny result of Putin's policy. Russia has not gained any more greatness. It has alienated everyone in the world. It has finally finalized the breakup of the Soviet Union because everyone is now fearing Russia. No single post-Soviet state will ever come into an alliance with Russia, not even Lukashenko, not even Belarus. Russia is not even able to make the Anschluss of Belarus. Kazakhstan is now, of course, fearing Russia and will be, drifting towards China and towards Turkey. And, Azerbaijan will be drifting towards Turkey. The Baltic states will be inviting more NATO troops. Georgia and Ukraine, at least rhetorically now, on the way to NATO. Not that I don't think they will, in the foreseeable future ever join NATO. Right, but at least Russia's policy has pushing away all the neighbors and isolating itself and becoming a besieged fortress. So this is really ridiculous.
I'm going to try to play devil's advocate. As a result of Putin's actions, yes, Georgia or Ukraine are not aspiring to Russia as they are aspiring to European Union or NATO or the West at large, but his actions brought him leverage to Putin. He is a person who gets one-on-one meetings with newly elected US president. He is the one who gets to negotiate on the new borders of Europe or where the NATO troops will be located. Tell me about that.
No, I mean, it's a joke. Negotiating the new borders of Europe, it's a crazy fancy, wet dream of the Russian elite. I mean, nobody's ever going to be talking about borders with Russia. I mean, what leverage does Russia have? Okay, so of course he has these symbolic meetings. Russia is still a major player in world affairs. It has nuclear weapons. It has a UN Security Council seat. It is still a major supply of hydrocarbon resources, but it doesn't mean Russia is a decider in the world affairs, or Russia can dictate the new borders of Europe, the new borders of NATO. It's not 1945. When Stalin in the white uniform was standing over the map of Europe with 13 million Red Army in the center of Europe. Russia is nowhere close. Militarily, it's not even close to NATO. Like economically, it's not even close to NATO. These are all fantasies and simulations and dreams of the Putin elite. So this leverage only works for the Russian TV, for the consumers of the Russian propaganda. I mean, in the real world affairs and geopolitics, Russia is a dwarf.
Yet in 2008 and 2014, Russia did militarily change borders in Europe for the first time since the end of the Second World War. Is that something Kremlin is using for domestic nurturing of its electors, or is it something they're using it as a weapon to show their greatness internationally?
No, it's both. It's fulfilling, Putin has a dream of being, of reinstating some forms of the new Russian Empire, the new edition of the Soviet Union. But once again, what he has achieved, I mean, he hasn't ruined the Georgian statehood. He hasn't, incorporated Georgia. He hasn't annexed Georgia. Yes, he has taken two large chunks of Georgian territory. He has taken parts of Ukrainian territory, but that's all he could get. And I mean, these are still not parts of Russia, technically. These are not, these are unrecognized states. This is a problem which has to be solved for the future generations. And if anything, the Ukrainian state and the Georgian state has been further consolidated in their independence, sovereignty, and pro-Western orientation. So strategically, none of his visions have been achieved. It's not like Hitler's Anschluss of Austria or of of the Czech Republic, right? When states cease to exist. So it's once again, these are just okay. These are bloody. I know this is very painful for the Georgian audience, for the Ukrainian audience. We're talking about tens of thousands of people killed, right? We're talking about zones of conflict in the eastern fringes of Europe. But once again, from a long-term strategic geopolitical perspective, he has just acquired toxic stretches of territory, which are on Russia's payroll, which has absolutely no strategic value, which have absolutely no, give Russia no leverage in talks with the West, doesn't increase Russia's geopolitical position, doesn't increase Russia's role in the world. These are just, once again, these are not assets, these are liabilities. So he has acquired new liabilities and new problems and relations with the outside world. If this is the outcome of, of a great imperial policy, come on, I'm the Roman Pope.
Yet he's been in power for 20 years. Explain that to me.
Well, he is popular in Russia. Probably this is the leader that Russia deserves. Probably he is in agreement. He is like a manifestation of the dreams of the large part of the Russian population. He is some kind of a manifestation of Russian history. So Russian history produces such characters from time to time, and various world nations produce dictators of this magnitude. And despite the fact that this is an authoritarian dictatorship, he is not. I wouldn't say that this is a totally undemocratic rule. This is an undemocratic country, but I mean this is a representative rule. Most people don't see any other ruling Russia than Putin at this moment. This is a very, so this is a question not about Putin, this is a question about Russia.
So the big question that we hear time after time, what happens after Putin, whenever it is?
I absolutely don't know. I'm probably a bad political analyst. I'm not a political analyst at all. I'm just an observer. And I really don't know. Anything can happen. This is like a wide range of options. This could be anything from nuclear war to a flourishing democratic Russia, to the breakup of the country, to, President Navalny, to President Shoigu, to, President KGB, anything. I mean, the point is he has, we cannot structurally think about the future. This man has really devoured the future. The entire politics of the country, all the institutions have been concentrated in the figure and in the health of one man. So we're all just depending on the condition of health of Vladimir Putin. So when he dies, this will be like, I think, a breakup of the system, because there are no guarantors, there are no institutions, there are no successors, there are no elites. There are no contenders. It will be all wide. Well, there will be contenders, but they will be wide open. Anything can happen, and we are not even allowed to think about the possibilities which come up after Putin. It's like Stalin. It's like asking, and we're in 1950, and we're asking what will happen with the Soviet Union when Stalin dies in 1953. The answer is we don't know. Like Beria could have won in 1953, Russia could have turned a pro-Western state, or for instance, there could be a much harsher regime in the Soviet Union in 1953. Nobody could have expected the coming of Khrushchev. Same with the Soviet Union, like we're living in 1982 and we're asking the question, what happens when Brezhnev dies or Chernenko dies, right? We don't know. Like each time the future of the country is wide open. And this is wide open once again.
30 years ago, when the Soviet Union was coming to an end, there was a hope, predominantly in the West, that Russia was opening up, if not becoming a liberal democracy as we know it overnight, it was opening up. Was there reciprocity about that domestically in Russia?
Well, yeah, 30 years ago, there was a time of hope and a new beginning and a fresh start. It was like the Soviet Union after Russia, after the revolution of 1917, when, yes, there were some bloody developments, but people were thinking about the future. It was some kind of a new futurism. And yeah, I think a generation was born that was made that learned to live independently from the state, make their own choices, make their own decisions. I mean, these people have stayed. You see, the point is that we have to keep in mind that Russia is always a very multi-layered story. So I was speaking up till now until just one layer of political developments, of foreign policy, of the Kremlin, of the Putin elite. But then you have to understand that this is just one part of the story. It's a story which takes place in the Kremlin and on the TV screens. But then behind this is a totally different country. There's another Russia. Formally, it supports Putin, but informally, it's totally apart. It lives its own life. It could go to China, for instance, one day. It could build its own economy. It could survive on its own means without the involvement of the state. We have the so-called the big garage economy, people living absolutely apart from the state and from the state statistics, having almost a second GDP, producing this sort of a gray sector economy. So, I mean, normally this all goes unnoticed, but each time there's a change in the country, there's a second Russia, or the real Russia, it just comes up and builds a new life and a new reality. So this has to be kept in mind. But generally speaking, as of today, I would say there's little sense of the future in the country. People are just have very short life plans, like 2 weeks, 2 months. I don't think anyone thinks even 1 year ahead in Russia. And there's lots of social frustration also because of the pandemic, the huge losses we have in the pandemic. There is a social atomization. People have little trust in the institutions, in each other, and so on. So socially and psychologically, Russia is in a very sorry state this time. But yeah, we're like, it's a country in limbo. Sort of summing up, we are an empire which hasn't broke up. We are a nation state which hasn't come into being. We are a country without a future, without a vision of the future. We're a country without a society. There's no such thing as a Russian society. This is just a population. We have a population, not a society, not a nation. We have this very dismembered and atomized population. So there is a famous quote from the Master and Margarita. When first the devil meets the protagonists on the Patriarchy Pons in Moscow, and he asks, do you have God? He says, no, we don't have God. But do you have devil? No, we don't have devil either. He says, what a strange nation. Whatever you ask for, they don't have anything. So I can just repeat this word. So this is a strange nation. Whichever you ask for, we don't have anything. We just have illusions of empire, illusions of the state, illusions of government. But this is just simulations. And we have no certainty about the future either.
It's a very pessimistic picture you're drawing.
I don't know. I wouldn't say so. It's a realistic picture, but I think uncertainty about the future is probably one of the rather optimistic conclusion, because we know many times when we were so pessimistic about the future, and then the future happened in ways absolutely unexpected, as it was in 1917, as it was in 1953, as it was in 1991. Each time Russia, comes forward in ways unexpected and rather, welcome for the world. So we don't know. It's rather an agnostic position, but being agnostic doesn't necessarily mean being pessimistic.
Thank you very much for the time and for fascinating discussion again.
Happy holidays, Nana, and yeah, hopefully, coming to Tbilisi is always happy to do this whenever there is a chance.